Hi, welcome to the first ever episode of the Wrestling Journal. I'm X Harper, I'm going to be your host, and we're going to explain in this episode more about what the Wrestling Journal is, why I started it, what we're going to do on every episode, what we're going to look at, and how we're going to review wrestlers. Firstly, let me just take a moment to explain what and why Wrestling Journal. I've been a wrestling fan my whole life, and I've loved wrestling since I can remember. I remember being a really little kid. One of my first memories of wrestling was back when my dad took me and my brother and my mum to a wrestling event. I can't remember where it was. It was either Skegness or it was Bognor Regis. It was one of those two places, and there was a wrestling event on with Big Daddy, Giant Haystacks, and I think those two were in a tag team match. So it was, I can't imagine who their opponents were, the poor guys fighting against those giants. And then the main event, I believe, was Kamala versus the British Bulldog. And then there must have been other matches, but I was too young. And so my first memory was Giant Haystacks walking past. I was on the front row or the second row. And I remember Giant Haystacks walking past me, and I just looked up, and it was like when you're looking up at a mountain, and I've had the privilege of being in Africa in front of Mount Kilimanjaro, and you have this massive shadowy figure in the distance, and it's just like, that's not the mountain, is it? It like the sky looks grey, but it's actually the shadow of the mountain that you can't see yet. And that was what happened when I saw Giant Haystacks. It was just like the sky went grey, and then all of a sudden this big dark figure walks past, and you're like, holy crap, this isn't just the room lights dimming or going out completely. This is actually one big ass wrestler walking past. And so I watched that. My brother didn't like wrestling, and I remember him telling me at the time, we were sitting in like the interval between the tag match and the main event. And my brother said to me, he was with his mate that had come on holiday with us, and they were sort of giggling away, and they said, you know this is fake, right? You know this is all a show, it's all a joke. And I was like, no, it's not. And me and him had an argument. My brother, we always argued, but we argued this time about wrestling being real. And then I think it just got to a point where I was like, do you know what? I'm going to find out. And I walked up to Big Daddy, who was signing autographs at the back on a table. And I just remember saying to Big Daddy, my brother just told me that wrestling's fake. Is it real or is it fake? And Big Daddy looks at me, and then he's like, you go and get your brother. You tell him to meet me in that ring, and we'll find out if it's real or fake. And I always remember going back. I was like 7 or 8 years of age. But I remember like my chest puffed out at that point, and I got very proud, and I sort of strutted back to my seat, sat down, and I was like, bro, Big Daddy said he wants you in the ring, and he's going to show you whether it's real or fake. And my brother actually, considering it was his little brother delivering the news, he actually looked quite intimidated and upset that had happened. And there was me, and I sat there happily for the rest of the show, just sort of chuffed that Big Daddy had shut my brother up for me. So that was my first like interaction of wrestling. I also won a flipping radio contest when I was a kid in 1994, I believe it was. WCW were doing a tour of the UK, and it was when Hulk Hogan had just signed for the company. And I remember I went on the radio and won a contest, so I actually got to sit on the front row at this WCW event at the NEC in Birmingham, which is where I'm from, if you can't tell already. And I remember I couldn't see over the front row, because back then, if you were a kid, it was actually bad to sit near the front because you just couldn't see above the ring. The ring was on a platform that was elevated from the steel barricades. So I couldn't really see the ring. And I remember saying to my dad, I can't see anything. And so my dad complained, and they actually moved us to arguably better seats. I mean, looking back at it now, I wish I'd stayed on the front row just for the fact of saying I was in the front row. But when they moved me back, they moved us to sort of eye level with the ring, and we were still pretty close. And Hacksaw Jim Duggan was there, and he did the big ho, and looked directly at me and gave me the thumbs up. So that was another one of my sort of early wrestling memories that I ever have. So I was really pleased leaving that event knowing that Hacksaw Jim Duggan had stuck his thumb up at me and did the ho thing. So that was a nice introduction to my history of wrestling. I grew up loving it. There's actually a current WE wrestler who went to school with me and was one of my older brother's best mates at high school. So it's really good to know that one of his friends is now WE wrestler, superstar, all that jazz. And it won't be hard to tell who it is because there aren't that many English kids in the business. I grew up around wrestling where, for some reason in Birmingham in particular in England, it was a hotbed and everyone loved it and there was a real hardcore following. That was my thing. I love WE, I love WCW. I grew up in the Attitude Era. I'm 34 now, so I was really in my I was in my teenage years as the Attitude Era kicked off and lived it out throughout the best years of my life while I was at school. So for me, it was like just a great time in my life, but it was also just the very best time of wrestling. And I was old enough to understand, but young enough to enjoy. And that was the best part about growing up during the Attitude Era when I did. And I just think that I took it in, I enjoyed it. And this project, the Wrestling Journal, is born out of that. It's really something that I've wanted to do for a very long time. The Wrestling Journal, for me, I'm fed up of wrestling journalism. I think that I come from a football background. My real career has been in football. So when I look at journalism, I see it differently to how the wrestling journalists are. Wrestling journalists to me are fake. They're as fake as what people call wrestling. They're not real journalists. I really don't have that much respect for them because, to be quite honest, they're just fans who want to be in the business, but they're not willing to do the hard work of being a wrestler or getting involved in that way. Maybe they're not capable, whatever. But they're the one group of people within wrestling that I really just don't have much respect for, and I certainly don't hold them in very high regard. They don't report factual stuff. They report based on scripted storylines, and that there's nothing worse for me than that. What I do love are documentaries like The Dark Side of the Ring. Unbelievable series. I absolutely love that. Wrestling with Shadows, when I watched that growing up, obviously about Bret Hart. These were programs that really sucked me in because I felt like I'm actually seeing the journalistic point of view here of we're looking objectively at wrestling and we're actually reviewing it and seeing the ins and outs without any bias. It's almost like, neutral people have come in and had a look at it and given it a journalistic viewpoint. And that's what I like, but I don't see it existing in the wrestling community at the moment. Certainly not enough. I look at people like Dave Meltzer, and there are some great historians, but they're terrible journalists. So I don't really listen or follow any of those guys at all. It's very rare for me to really listen to them. I like historians of wrestling. I like people who just know the business. They know a load of the history of wrestling, but they're not trying to be a reporter or a journalist. I like those guys because they know what they are and they're not trying to be something else. So the Wrestling Journal for me was all about, I just want as a fan to review wrestlers. I just want as a fan to talk about wrestlers and to observe them and to review them and to rate them. The wrestling community's always got people talking about who's the best wrestler, who's the greatest of all time, who's the GOAT. And you hear that conversation and you see remarks about modern wrestlers being the greatest of all time, blah, blah, blah. And eventually you just start thinking, is this a phrase that people just use lightly? Do we just throw that around now to every wrestler that gets a little bit of popularity in the business, that all of a sudden they're the greatest wrestler of all time? And do people really understand the context of that phrase? To say that you're the greatest wrestler of every wrestler that's ever existed, do they understand the gravity of what they're saying? And my answer is no, they don't. So when I throw it around, I only throw it around for the person or the people that I think are genuinely in the contention for the GOAT. And certainly when it comes to modern day wrestling, I'm not a big fan. I'm going to tell you this right now, as before we even start doing any of the reviews. I don't rate it very highly. I think that the ratings of the business at the moment are a perfect illustration of where we're at in terms of the popularity of wrestling, the mainstream appeal that it doesn't have, and really quite how it's struggling to find its identity again. I think it lost its identity in the early 2000s when once wrestling was exposed as being scripted. Ever since then, the wrestling business has really been fighting to keep its identity, and for a while it managed to hold on to it and even grow during the Attitude Era, but then in the middle of it all, it started to crash. And once wrestling lost its superstars, once it lost the biggest characters it's ever had, wrestling wasn't able to hold on and maintain the audience that it had generated. And so for me, I look back at that and I just think, do you know what? I want this to be better. I want to be able to make a change and do something that helps establish the reality of what wrestling is compared to what it used to be. And that's why with the Wrestling Journal, I'm wanting to look at reviewing wrestlers, both modern and from the past, and actually putting them in one cumulative list and saying, this isn't necessarily a definitive list. This is me as a fan saying that this is what I believe, who is the best wrestler, who are the best wrestlers, and why. And so the podcast gives me a way of explaining that and demonstrating some examples, but also conjuring up a little bit of discussion, hopefully, within the community. As we journey through this process, as each episode is released, as we talk about different wrestlers, what I want to do is obviously shoot out the hashtag The Wrestling Journal and say to you guys, if you want to debate, let's talk about it online. Let's actually get a discussion going about wrestlers and who really is truly the greatest of all time, which ones should have had more than they deserved, which ones are what they are, who could have been better, who was overpushed, who was underpushed, all that stuff. Let's do that online and let's have a conversation. The one thing I am going to say about online conversations before we start, be respectful. My opinions on modern wrestling aren't great. I'm very critical. I'm very cynical of wrestling at the moment. However, I'm always up for a discussion, and I think if you approach discussion respectably online, you're always going to reciprocate a great conversation, and you're always going to end up getting more from that conversation than you came into it with. Whereas if you go into a conversation trying to start an argument, you're not going to leave with anything, with any more knowledge. You're not going to learn anything. You're going to appear like a bit of a prick. You're just not going to come across as a good person. So all I'm asking is be respectful. When we talk about wrestlers and subjects and things around wrestling, let's try and engage and learn from each other. I've learned a great deal about modern wrestling because I've engaged, even though it's been negative from my end. Like I've told people, I don't think he's very good. I don't think X wrestler is good, or this storyline's very good. I still want to try and understand why other people like it and think it's good. And that's not to be patronizing, that's just simply to say, I want to know, I want to understand like the modern wrestling fan and where you're coming from, because if we don't understand the business, if we don't understand the audience, how is wrestling ever going to grow? And especially with things like the podcast, I want to be able to suggest some of my own ideas on booking and all that stuff as a fan. And I can't do that unless I actually know something about modern wrestling, unless I actually understand something about it. I really don't have that opinion to share. So you're going to see me talk a lot about what could have happened, who previous wrestlers from the past could wrestle with now, and vice versa. And I want to talk about all that stuff. But in order to do it, I need to have a better understanding. So I'm still learning in this process. Let's not forget that. And at the same time, let's go forward together and let's try and learn about both the history of wrestling. Let's enjoy it. Let's respect the people who've paved the way for the current superstars that we see today. And also let's give a bit of respect to those current superstars as they try to navigate a way back to the popularity and the pomp of yesteryear and all of the greatness that came from years gone by in the wrestling industry. So let's be done with that conversation now. So that's why I started it. This is all a passion project. I want to be able to report on wrestlers and to review both past and present and give you guys something to talk about online that hopefully will come from more of a serious place and analytical place than I'm a wrestling fan and I just want to have a laugh, have a joke, and just take the pee out of everything I'm watching and thinking. I'm much more of a serious guy. You're going to get that from the podcast. I like to have a bit of a laugh and I like to joke around about stuff, but for me, the Wrestling Journal is something that's meant to be serious, analytically looking at wrestlers and rating them respectably rather than just looking at them as these are fun people, that characters we can just have a laugh about today and then forget about tomorrow. So for me, it's more about chronologically making and establishing much more importance of what it is to be a professional wrestler, whether it's today or in years gone by. Hopefully it'll inspire some of the modern guys to do more as well. That would be my ultimate aim. I would love to know that there would be modern wrestlers who hear a review about themselves or hear a review about one of their peers and then they just look and say, actually, they've got a point. Like, I want to be better than this. I want to do more. And this is what I'm going to have to do in order to get to those levels. So the structure of every episode that gets released will be this. I'm going to release roughly 20 episodes per season. And the seasons will be based on every 4 months. Okay? And the reason I'm doing that is because it gives me an excuse to change branding, to be quite honest. I'm going to change up the designs that I've got. If you're following me on Twitter, 2 accounts to follow. One is at xharperco, so that's XHARPERCO. And then the other one, of course, is at Wrestling Journo. So it's journal minus the A and the L, add an O, Wrestling Journo. So you can follow those 2 accounts and I post loads of stuff on there. I'm going to be posting all of the ratings of each wrestler. I'm going to be revealing who I'm going to be reviewing each week. We're going to just have general discussions as well. I'm going to obviously use the online world, Twitter, etc., to garner conversations and information about what I'm going to discuss on each program. So it's important to be on there, to follow me, to make sure that you're inside that conversation as we grow and develop the series of the Wrestling Journal. And then also just to find out the future of what the Wrestling Journal is hopefully going to look like, depending on how well it does. So at the beginning of the show, what I'm going to do is spend a little bit of time each week looking into a hot topic that's been discussed online. And that will be something that it's negotiable. Like, it might be there one week, it might not be the next. Really depends what everyone's talking about. There's been some real hot topics come up this year in wrestling. Most of them negative, as you guys probably know. But what I'd like is just spend like a little bit of time at the beginning just to sort of dissect that topic and maybe give some insight into it. For example, I'll give you a nice light-hearted one that I saw the other day that I would happily explore on the first episode, but I probably won't. I'll do it here. There was a wrestler who I saw online. I think he's like part of a smaller indie promotion, but he tweeted about wrist tape and he was saying something like, only in wrestling do you go into a locker room and then you're scared of sharing your wrist tape because when you do, everyone's going to use it and it'll come back empty. And this was like a perfect topic for me to talk about. Background and life has all been around football. Even with that aside, when I was semi-pro, even when I was in youth team football, we have ankle tape, like you have sock tape, you have loads of little bits that you have as a professional footballer, and I'm sure that there are other sports that have this stuff as well. We used to use electric tape, essentially, electrical tape, and it was like £1.20 for a roll. So I get where this wrestler's coming from, because when I was a footballer, you would go into the changing room and you prepare all your kit, you've got all your gear in your bag, and I would have different compartments in my kit bag. So one of the pockets would have my tape, and it would have a black, a white, blue, and a red, usually, depending, because ultimately I think the teams I played for, you would usually wear, red would be a common colour for a football kit. I had green electric tape at one point because I played for a team that wore green. So it depended what kit you were wearing. That would depend on what tape you would wear as well. It's all very fashionable. The purpose of it was to hold the shin pads in place. It was to hold my shin guard in place, and I would put it below my shin pad and then at the top of my shin pad as well, just below my knee, to hold my socks up. So that was like the actual purpose of it. But it just made me laugh because I think it's a perfect illustration of what the wrestling community is like in 2020, where for some bizarre reason, wrestlers and wrestling fans feel like wrestling is isolated in this very special, unique bubble that is separated from the rest of society and culture. It's almost like there's this grand delusion where wrestling is in its own universe, and I think maybe people have taken the WE universe saying literally and think that they're out in a different galaxy, because they come out with these stupid ideas that somehow they're the only ones who have problems, they're the only ones who have issues, they're the only ones who struggle with certain things. So I just thought it was ridiculous and outrageous. I actually commented back, didn't get a response. Nobody responded because, of course, lo and behold, someone with experience in another sport, how dare they come in and say, actually, you're wrong, this happens everywhere else. Making wrestlers and wrestling fans feel like what they love isn't quite as important as they think it is. I mean, I'm a wrestling fan at heart, but I'm also a realist. Like, I know there's a real world out there outside of wrestling, and I've experienced some of that, so I can bring that into my opinions on stupid comments from indie wrestlers who are trying to complain about worrying about sharing wrestling tape. And as a kid, I had those issues. You know, as a kid in football, I worried about sharing my tape. I didn't want to give it away because there was a part of me that was like, I'm prepared, you're not. Why would I give you something when you were too lazy to prepare yourself? But I was a kid. I was like 16. If adults in wrestling are behaving like 16-year-old kids, that's the problem with wrestling at the moment. Just a really weird mentality. It's like, grow up, be a man, don't complain about it on Twitter. Just go and talk to the guys yourself. Say no, be a flipping grown adult and just say, do you know what? Bring your own tape next time, buddy. You're not having mine. End of. And it's funny things like this that I see in wrestling today, which it really add up to my picture of the business, that it's failing, it's falling apart. I don't think it's going to die. And it's hard because people use the phrase wrestling's dying. And I'm like, it's definitely in decline. I don't think anybody can argue that wrestling is in decline. If you look at ratings and if you look at the fan base, it's not going upwards. There's no upward trajectory in this business at the moment. It's going down. And I'm talking very much from a Western cultural perspective as well, because of course in India and in other places all across the world where there are high populations, wrestling is still going to be loved and admired. Saudi Arabia is just really picking it up with all these events that they're getting in WE. So obviously I'm not stupid. I know that across the world wrestling is actually probably growing as exposure grows in those regions, but in the Western world where wrestling has been exposed for a long time, it's been around for a while, it's definitely dropping off in popularity. People don't care about it anymore. And that's hopefully the perspective that I'm going to bring to this. I'm a fan of wrestling and I love wrestling, but I'm not what you would call a hardcore fan. I don't ever pretend to be a hardcore fan. I feel like it because I have such a love and passion for wrestling. But the problem is that I'm also a realist, and I know that I really don't like the current product. I don't like the storylines. I think that it's a disengaging mess at the moment. It feels like every show is trying to emulate WCW in 99, 2000, rather than emulating WCW in 96, 97, when it was starting to push boundaries and do things differently and do original things that actually got attention from a wider audience than just the hardcore basement dwelling wrestling fans. And I'm using that stereotype loosely. I know that not every hardcore wrestling fan is living in their parents' basement still, but I do think that that stereotype exists for a reason. Because a lot of wrestling fans online are very toxic, they're very negative and rude to anybody who disagrees or has a negative view of the business in its current state. Stop bullying people online, guys. That's just a statement from a wrestling fan who's disengaged with the current product. Stop picking on people who say that wrestling is bad. It could be that it is bad for a majority of people. And you might love it. You might have posters of every wrestler that's currently around, and you might bathe yourself in orange juice, celebrating Orange Cassidy's latest dramatic performance or whatever he's doing. But ultimately, for the mass audience, for people who like wrestling but don't love it to the point where they will religiously watch, for those people, they don't give a crap. They don't care. I don't care about AEW. I wanted to. When I first heard about AEW, I wanted to love it and I wanted to get behind it and support it. But ultimately, AEW has become the same as it's WE 2.0 to me. It's just a slightly upgraded version from what I've seen. I think it's a better product, but at the same time, some of the stories are absolutely disastrous and they're just so stupid that it makes the whole program impossible for me to want to watch as a wrestling fan. And I'm a wrestling fan, which really upsets me because I want to see a product that actually engages me and inspires me to want to watch, but also to be proud enough to tell people who I know who love wrestling but don't watch it anymore. Because when you engage with me and people like me, that's when wrestling's going to start reaching mainstream, because I'm a fringe wrestling fan. I'm on the fringes where I keep an eye on what's going on, but I don't watch it every week. But I've also got loads and loads of friends who are like me, and even worse, some people who loved it when it was popular and now they don't watch wrestling again. 95% of my friends aren't wrestling fans, but they liked it during the Attitude Era. 5% of my friends I've met online who are hardcore fans of wrestling, and that's what they do. They watch wrestling and they love it. And I hate reading a lot of my Twitter feed because I know I'm going to see a load of overhyped bullcrap about wrestling. And I've given it a try myself. I've watched a few episodes here and there. I've watched some of the pay-per-views. I've tried to get into it. I just can't. It's not that great. However, with all that said, there are some great wrestlers today. There are some really good wrestlers who've got great potential, but the companies that own them, that are running them, are just not delivering stories and characters that need to be delivered. So I feel like a lot of potential is being ruined and let down in today's wrestling scene. That's my personal opinion of it. And that's going to be taken into account when we look at wrestlers and rate them based on who they were, and obviously the modern wrestlers today as well. Comparatively, you're always going to look at the height of the Attitude Era as being the peak of wrestling throughout history. So bear that in mind as we talk about reviews and as we look at different wrestlers. I am going to try and do reviews of both modern and past wrestlers as well. So don't worry, this isn't going to be a legends only podcast. I am going to look at many of the modern wrestlers that we see today. It means that I'm going to have to watch more of their matches, which is fine by me. I'm all right with that. I'm going to put myself through those matches because I know on the flip side, I'm going to get to watch some great matches from legends that I grew up loving and growing to love, and people who became my sort of idols, I guess, as a kid. People I looked up to and just were inspired by. So I'm going to take the bad with a lot of the good, and that's okay by me. So once we've done a hot topic, I've just gone off on one and shown you exactly what I'm going to do by talking about stupid wrist tape, and that has taken me on another avenue. Once we've looked at whatever hot topic it is, and I'm only going to try and look at one or two. I don't want to go... I could talk all day about ridiculous topics, but I don't want to do that. So I'm going to try and focus on one each week if there's anything to talk about. And we'll look at that, and then we'll jump into and answering any questions that have come online. So it might be a bit of a Q&A. It really depends on you guys and who responds, who talks online. Once all of these things happen with the hot topics, it's down to you guys listening to engage with me. So you're going to have to use the hashtag The Wrestling Journal. You're going to have to talk about what's going on. You're going to have to chat with me. Talk to me about the reviews that I've done each week. If you don't agree, let me know. If there's something I've missed, send me links. Let me see it. I'll watch it if I can. If I've got the time, I will give all of that effort to what you're talking about. And let's engage in a conversation. And what I will do is I will use this next segment of each program just to discuss some of the questions that you've asked and to debate anything from the last episode, any feedback that you've given me from the last episode. I'll look at that as well. Like I said, be respectful. That's the only way that I'm ever going to mention you on the program. I will not be talking or engaging with people who are just completely disrespectful, think that they know everything, tell me that they're right and I'm 100% wrong. You're not going to get mentioned if you talk like that. Be respectful, and you've got every chance of being mentioned in this segment, and I'm sure we'll be able to further that conversation online as well through Twitter, etc., etc. So after we've had the community feedback, after we've talked, then it's the main event. Then we're going in to the wrestler review for that episode. To do this, I've had to break down each wrestler's characteristics, if you like, or traits into 8 different areas. And then we've grouped those 8 into 2 groups of 4. And I'll explain that in a minute. But before we do that, let's talk about the important part here. We're going to end the episode with the ranking, the overall rank of each wrestler. And that rank is on a list of, at the moment, it's a list of over 300 male wrestlers that I have and over 57 female wrestlers. Those lists will remain separate. There is also a stables list, a tag team list, a managers list, but we won't deal with any of those yet. We're just going to stick with the male wrestling roster at this time because there are so many of them. Like I said, over 300, so plenty of episodes to get through. And that rank that we get to at the end of each episode will obviously tell you where they sit in that ranking, in that list. Each individual wrestler, though, even though everybody ranks in a unique position, every wrestler will have a rating out of 100. And that rating will essentially dictate where they finish on the ranking chart. Some wrestlers will have the same rating, but no one will have the same ranking. I'm not doing this like so-and-so is joint 2nd or joint 3rd or joint 25th or joint 212. You are literally the rank that my database puts you in based on whatever it is. Probably alphabetical order once they're equal on rating. And I'm okay with that. If they're the same, it's fine. The point is that you get the gist of where they are based on their ranking. Even if they're in the top 5, you get that they're in the top 5. And quite honestly, the top wrestler in my list is above the 2nd place. So, and then I believe the 2nd place is equal with someone else. And then there's a load of equal ones, but it's great to watch. It's great to go through and to see. And we will discuss that as we go through each review. So we've got the ranking, we've got the rating out of 100. So to do that, as I mentioned, we've got 2 groups of 4 characteristic traits. Now, the first group are the main group, and they're going to be scored out of 22 for each one, and that equals 88 points overall that you can score from this section. So this is sort of the main section. And then the second group of 4s, they will be scored out of 3 stars for each section, and each star represents 1 point. So essentially you've then got the final 12 points up for grabs on this sort of bonus section. The reason I've done that is that the first 4 are the main areas of a wrestling persona, but the second 4 are all about more of the legacy of what the wrestler has left behind or what they've achieved. So the 2 are separate. One of them is what they've can deliver at their peak, but the second is actually what they achieved so throughout their career. And there's a big difference between the two. And I've found that it works really well when it comes to like rating people out of 100. For my list, it works perfectly. I look at the list and I'm very happy with the way that all of the wrestlers are rated. And it's really cool to see that ranking be built over time, because you realize that some of the wrestlers you really like actually do sit as high as you like them. But then there are others who I loved as a fan who actually sit lower on the list than I thought they would. And that's because I've tried to be as fair as possible when I score my wrestlers, when I rate them, and when I review them. Which is why I want to do the podcast, because I believe that I want to be as fair as possible when I'm reviewing these wrestlers. I don't want to be biased and just put my favourite wrestler of all time at the top just because. And just to let you know, my two favourite wrestlers of all time do not sit 1 and 2 on the ranking. In fact, they're quite a way down the list, because I've tried to be as fair as I can when rating everyone. And I've also grown a much bigger appreciation for wrestlers that I previously thought I didn't really like, but then I've watched their stuff because I've rated them, and I'm like, oh, I actually really like this dude now. So there are a bunch of wrestlers that I've actually come to grow to like because of doing this list. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to do this, the Wrestling Journal, is that I want to help other fans discover great wrestlers, whether it's modern day or from the past. Before I go into this final thing, there are two sort of traits that I believe overarch all of the other things, but they're not really their own category. They kind of infiltrate every category rather than having their own category. And those are charisma and overness. Now, overness is a ridiculous word to use, but I've done it anyway. That's all to do with how the audience receive the wrestler, whether they're a heel or a face, it doesn't matter. As long as they're over in either way, that's the main thing. But also looking at it from a wider perspective, what was their reach into the mass audience as well? How did they break into the non-wrestling audience? Did they do that? If they did, that's great, they're more over, and then therefore that also infiltrates and influences the stats and the numbers. The other one is charisma. Charisma infiltrates everything, because somebody's natural charisma will naturally explode into all those different areas, regardless of what it is. And I'll give those examples as we go through this list now. So the first of the 4 major traits for any wrestler, we've got character, physique, mic skills, and technique. So those are the 4 major ones. Character is all about, and the best way of me describing this, I'm going to try and use real life scenarios to do this. Macho King, Macho Man, Macho Madness. Those are the characters that Randy Savage develops over time, dependent on what promotion he's working for. Those are the characters that we're going to review. And the charisma that Randy Savage has influences all of those characters differently. And obviously, each of those characters are over in different ways. I'm going to try on my review to always look at the most over character of each wrestler. And that's where I will review. In some cases, when I watch matches and things like that to base on the stats, sometimes I'm going to jump between characters just because I'm reviewing different elements of them as a wrestler, such as their technique or their physique or their mic skills. So the physique side is a little bit more of a grey area, because there are so many different body style shapes and fits, and everything just looks different in wrestling. Everybody seems to have their own unique body. They're either, height-wise, weight-wise, shape-wise, everything's different. But the main reason why physique is important, and this is going to sound Vince McMahonish, but the main reason why I think it's important is it's all about the intimidation and believability factors. How believable does the wrestler look, and how intimidating are they? And when I say intimidating, that's not always a negative. Sometimes you can be intimidated by somebody, but in a positive way, like in awe of who they are. I mentioned earlier, I told the story about giant haystacks. I was intimidated as a kid and I was scared, but now looking back as an adult who loves wrestling, I love the fact that Giant Haystacks was Giant Haystacks. I love that he was a big fat ass dude who was scary to look at. He was so big that he became bigger than life to me. And that was awesome because I felt that it was unattainable. And I still do. I'm a very skinny guy, but that to me is what wrestling is in its essence. It's believable, but it's unattainable. It should never quite be something that you can reach and do, but it should always be something that you can believe can happen. Okay? And to help explain what I mean there, Shawn Michaels or Bret Hart, who are my height, I believe that, like who they are, I believe that they're good, strong, solid wrestlers. I believe that they could beat Yokozuna, that they could beat Kevin Nash or Psycho Sid and blah, blah, blah. I believe they could beat the big guys because they're good enough at what they do. But it's slightly unattainable because their skill level is so far above where I am, sitting here right now in a chair doing a podcast. Could I ever get to their level? Maybe if I dedicated myself so much. Maybe I could end up getting somewhere near them. But I would have to do a lot to get there. And that's what I think wrestling should be. That you know and understand that these are elite people. No matter how they look, they're elite. A sumo wrestler is an elite athlete, and yet he's out of shape compared to a bodybuilder. So it's not about muscle mass. It's about this idea of this aura of, are they elite? And I know this is a popular saying at the moment in wrestling, but like, are they elite? Do they look like people who are in the top 8% or 5% of the world at what they do? Because I shouldn't feel like I'm in that. And that, unfortunately, is where I think a lot of modern day wrestling is. I actually know that I could get in a ring and look better than some of the wrestlers that I see today. I know it, and I've got no experience in wrestling. And yet I know I could get in a ring and do a better job than some of these wrestlers do. And that's bad. That is not what wrestling should be about. Wrestling should always be the fans are looking in, wanting to be those people, but knowing that it's going to take a heck of a lot of work to get there. And that's why I love classic wrestling. That's why I'm a big fan of the past, because in times gone by, they've always maintained the elite element. And I think WE still tries to maintain that elite status as a wrestling company, which is why I think they always win. Whoever comes up against them, WE always come out on top because they always maintain there's this elite element to what they do. So when it comes to physique, it's not all about muscle mass. You can be a big, intimidating person, that's great. But also, what I also factor into this is things like stamina. You know, when I talk about elite performers, you have to also include, well, what are the characteristics of elite performers? Elite performers can usually last longer than anybody else in their profession. They can usually do what they do at the highest level for longer than anybody else. That's what makes them elite. So Ric Flair, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, these are two guys who didn't look perfect. They had good bodies, but they weren't bodybuilders. They weren't shred. And yet, here they are doing 1 hour matches. Here they are going 45 minutes almost every night of a week. So that's really where the physique comes in. It's about looking at the whole picture and saying, is this person believable yet unattainable? And are they elite in their profession? And if they sort of fit all of those three, the higher they fit, the more points they get. Mike skills is obviously a little bit more about promo work. Mike skills can be a little bit misleading in the sense that it's not necessarily the words they use, but the psychology that they communicate. And I say that because there are plenty of wrestlers out there throughout history who have communicated without talking. Anybody who's watched Jake Roberts' promo knows that that dude can look into the camera and communicate more than a 10-minute Ultimate Warrior weird promo. So Mike Skills brings all of that into one, but the key word is psychology, telling a story. How does the person tell and communicate a story, and how well do they do that? The final of the big four traits is technique. I'm not talking about strong style or lucha style, Japanese style, whatever the styles of wrestling are. I'm not talking necessarily about that. The technique is actually more about how good are the wrestlers, how proficient are they at what they do, and how good are they at performing the moves that make them who they are. So, another issue I have with modern day wrestling is that everybody has the same moveset. Like, I could more or less... What's weird is that today I could put together a generic moveset for the modern wrestler, and I could guarantee that 80% of the wrestlers today would use at least half of the moves within that moveset, and that's bad. We've been in times in the past where we've had wrestlers who have completely different movesets to one another. There are always going to be popular moves. There are always going to be fashionable moves that come around, and somebody tries something innovative and everyone else is like, oh, I want to try that. There's always going to be stuff like that. So I get that. Shawn Michaels, you would see a lot of that copycat wrestling even in the Attitude Era. But every wrestler tried to make their own moves unique to them and who they were, who their character was, what their physique is. They weren't trying flips if they physically weren't capable, just because everyone else is. And today it seems like even the big guys are trying to do what the small guys do. And the small guys are trying to do stuff the big guys are doing, and it's merging into this point where no one's unique anymore. No one sells a move in their own way, and that's something that I really miss from wrestling. I just don't see people having good technique, and this is why I say charisma influences everything you do. I think that a Macho Man Randy Savage double axe handle from the top rope is different to a Tatanka double axe handle from the top rope, or an Ultimate Warrior double axe handle from the top rope. These wrestlers made those moves their own, even though it's a simple double axe handle. Each one of those three guys I've just mentioned, in my head now I picture it and I see the difference between the way each of them does it, because they just act differently as they do the move. Little nuances. The Warrior was more powerful. He would clasp his hands differently to the Macho Man. Macho Man would stall. He would wait a little bit longer. Because Macho Man was a better wrestler, he would build the tension before delivering a high move like that. That was a big spot to pull off, especially back in the 80s. So he would know to just hold on a little bit, but it made it unique to him. And different wrestlers did different things. You know, certain wrestlers would do big boots differently. A Kevin Nash big boot looked different to the Hulk Hogan big boot. Big Show big boot when he was the Giant looked completely different, but it felt unique to each wrestler. So when I talk about technique and when we review this, what I'm actually looking at is, does the wrestler own the move that he's performing? Does it feel like it's his move? And if not, that actually, even if he performs the move well, if it doesn't feel like it's his move, it devalues him as a wrestler. Because people, remember what I said before, people want to believe in wrestling, but it's got to be unattainable. If every move looks the same, people know they can attain to do it. It's like, oh, I could get up there and do a double axe handle from the top rope and it'd look exactly the same. I don't want to be able to do that. I don't want to be able to watch wrestling and think I can do it without a lot of work. And of course, there is the technical proficiency of being able to know wrestling, whether that's an amateur wrestling background, the variety of moves, all of that is blended in there as well. So it's a bigger than one area approach, but these are the different things that I'm looking at when I rate technique. So let's go into the 4 smaller 3-star bonus category, and let's just go through what they are. Before I do that, I want to just break down a couple of things, because there are words that I'm going to use that need to be described. There are 2 words, major and minor. There are major and minor titles, which I think everybody in wrestling knows. If you don't know, the difference between a major and minor title would be, a major title is a main event belt that you would see at WrestleMania. Like the biggest pay-per-view the company's got, the main event would be for the major title. It's usually 1 or 2 belts. In WE at the moment, it's the Universal title, it's the World, it's the WE Championship, whatever they call it. But those are the 2 belts in WE. In WCW, it was the World Heavyweight title. Minor belts are everything else. Any other title that's on the roster. So tag belts, hardcore title, European title, Intercontinental, television title, US title, UK title, whatever they call it, those are minor belts. And these are all within major companies. My critique of all the wrestlers is going to be in major companies only. If they've never wrestled in a major company, if they've wrestled in the indies, I'm not interested. If they've wrestled in minor companies, I'm happy to review them, but they're not going to score as high as people who've wrestled probably in the major companies. The major companies, and this is the second part, you've got the major and minor titles, but then you've got major and minor companies. The difference between the two, essentially, is the amount of reach and the ability to reach a wider audience than the hardcore wrestling fan. WE, WCW, and the NWA have done that at some point or other in the past. Those are the three organizations that I would consider major organizations at the moment. For AEW fans, I know that's going to make you cry and you're going to be sad. Tough. They're not an old enough company yet to be able to say that they've done that. WCW wasn't. It was a minor company in 94, in 95. Even after having Hogan, WCW was a minor player in the wrestling game. It was only when the NWO came out and they started to reach a mass audience that wasn't a Southern wrestling fan that WCW was recognized as a real competitor and as a major company. Okay, so I'm not just saying WCW since its inception, not by any means. WCW became that because they reached an audience that had never been reached before. WF had already done that. Vince McMahon did that with WrestleMania. The minute WrestleMania was released, they already hit a non-hardcore wrestling fan audience. They proved that they could reach it. And the NWA did it with Starrcade, and Starrcade obviously moved over as well. So NWA was just doing it with wrestling in general, but they still had pay-per-views as well that they were beginning to run. And the point that I'm making is they reached a much wider mass audience than just the hardcore wrestling fans that make up for a majority of the wrestling community. So AEW is not quite there yet. So they're still a minor company. So all of the belts have to be earned within one of the major companies. They can't. Minor companies I will count as minor championships, even if it's the AEW World title. It's part of a minor company, therefore it's a minor championship. The Impact World Heavyweight title is a minor belt. It's not seen as a major title until the company is a major company. So with all that said, the champion, there are 3 stars that you can pick up. You get 1 for being the minor champion, which we've already discussed. You get 1 star if you've been the major champion. And then you get a 3rd star if you've been a multi-time major champion. So the difference there would be Kofi Kingston has won the major title in WE once. Randy Orton's won it 8-9 times now, something like that. So Randy Orton would have 3 stars, Kofi Kingston would have 2. And the reason I separate that is just because I believe that when a company's willing to give you the title multiple times, it shows that there's a consistency in your performance levels that is above the average wrestler. Whereas somebody who's won a title once could have won it because WE just decided, or whatever company just decided that it was popular to give you the belt. Another example would be David Arquette in WCW. They gave him the title because it was a fashionable thing to do at that time. Vince Russo thought that would be and reach a mass audience by doing it. But he never won it back because he didn't sell and people didn't believe what was going on. They just felt like this is a piss take against wrestling. So that angle fell flat on its face as soon as it began. The next category is the tag team category. For 1 star, you have to have tag team experience. And again, this could be in a minor company, okay? Not the indies, but from a minor company or a major company. As long as you've been in a tag team, you'll get a star. If you've been a champion in one of the major companies, a tag team champion, then you'll get 2 stars. And then again, if you've been a multi-time tag team champion, you get 3 stars within a major company. So Harlem Heat would be a prime example of a tag team that have won the major belt, a major organization multiple times. So they would have Booker T, Stevie Ray would have 3 stars for their tag team. For the stable, which is the 3rd category, A stable to me is 3 wrestlers, okay? Not 2 wrestlers and a manager, but 3 wrestlers who don't manage each other. To me, the New Day are a tag team. The Fabulous Freebirds are a tag team because the one who wasn't wrestling was purposely a manager, and their goal was always to win the tag team titles. Stables like the NWO, it had 3 people to begin with, but Hogan wasn't the manager of the Outsiders. In fact, Hogan didn't go to the ring with the Outsiders because they were seen as 3 individual wrestlers. Even though 2 of them happened to be a tag team at the beginning, they were still very much 3 individual wrestlers. So that's the difference that I see between a stable and just a normal tag team. 1 star is actually if you've had a manager or been a manager. The reason I've done this is because I can't justify giving managers a whole category. There's just not enough reason to give. You can't give 3 stars for it. It just doesn't make sense. So having a manager or being a manager is one of the first steps in having a stable. So I justified it by putting it as the first star within the stable category. So if you've had a manager or if you've been a manager, you get 1 star in the stable category. The second star is if you have stable experience. So as long as you've been in a stable, regardless of managers and all that stuff, you get the 2nd star. I'll definitely say this. Most people who've been in a stable have had a manager at some point or been a manager, because they will often go out, as you guys will know, supporting other stable mates. The 4 Horsemen, each one of them would have gone out there and been a manager of one of their teammates at one point. It happens. Every stable does it. So I would say, and this is off my head, I reckon 90% of stable members have at least been a manager or managed or had a manager while they've wrestled within the stable. So I'm pretty confident that those 2 go hand in hand. That would be the 2nd star. The 3rd star is if you've led the actual stable. So Hulk Hogan's led a stable, he gets 3 stars. Nash and Hall led a stable with the NWO as well, 3 stars. Ric Flair led the 4 Horsemen, 3 stars. It's obviously based on the perception, and like I said before, how over these guys are, because sometimes a guy would be seen as heading up a stable even though they weren't necessarily seen as the lead by the boys. Goldberg and Sting are perfect examples. Like, the fans got them over so much that people recognized that Sting, Goldberg were the leaders of WCW. They were like, when WCW became like a stable, if you like, that's what happened. And it was a stable. If the NWO was a stable, so was WCW during that time period. And I know that sounds weird, but that's the way that WCW played it. There were times where WCW would fight against the NWO, and the chosen leader would be Goldberg, Sting, Luger, Flair, etc., etc. So you could say that Goldberg led a stable. Plus, I think there was, I can't remember the name, I think it was something like the Millionaires Club. I'm going to have to check this when I do the reviews for Goldberg, but I'm pretty sure there was like a specific club within WCW where Goldberg was in the stable and was part of, if not the leader in it. For someone like Steve Austin, Stone Cold was the leader of the ECW invasion angle, ECW/WCW angle, so he would have 3 stars for leading that. For the 4th and final part of this, we've got the legend category. Now, this is arguably the best one for me, and I think this one really distinguishes a lot of people and separates the meat from the chaff. You've got a legend that has never won a 1 star, so that would be someone like Kurt Hennig, Jake the Snake Roberts. I was going to say Lex Luger, but Lex did win the World Heavyweight title. So Jake, Rick Rude, people who are considered in the business as being just legends. And we all know what that means. It just means that at some point they've been in the main event and they just have left this tangible mark on the business where everybody knows who they are because of their uniqueness, their character. All of the traits that we've talked about have helped them to leave a good positive stain on the business where people remember that person specifically. Roddy Piper would be another example of that. So Without a title, you get 1 star. If they've won a major title, they get 2 stars. And then finally, if they've been a main eventer of the main show in the major company, they're also getting a bonus star. So if you've headlined WrestleMania, if you've headlined Starrcade, essentially you get another star for doing one of those things. I'm sure that AEW eventually will make that category, but right now they're too young, they're too small, and they don't have enough influence on a mass wider audience, in my opinion, for them to justifiably get that 3rd star. So AEW wrestlers, other than like WWE guys or XWE guys, are not going to be getting those stars anytime soon. So once I've done all that, I add it up, and then you get a number out of 100. We then get the overall rating, which, as I said earlier, that's what we then reveal at the end. And then finally, we're going to reveal the ranking of the wrestler, where they fit within the list as the overall greatest wrestler of all time. What I will do then is announce the next wrestler who's going to be reviewed, which I'm going to do now because we're at the end of this introductory video. So the next and the first wrestler that I'm going to review is a guy who made my day. When I started my Wrestling Journal Twitter account, he absolutely made my day because he followed me back first. He's my first follower. And it's very unusual for me to have like a legend as your first follower, like a wrestling legend. Somebody that I followed as a kid and I just loved and thought was so cool. And so I've decided to sort of, as a thank you, not only for what he's done in the business, but for following the Wrestling Journal without knowing me, without knowing anything about what this is all about, that I'm going to review him first. And that is none other than Big Sexy, Big Daddy Cool, Diesel, Kevin Nash. So Too Sweet. Kevin Nash is going to be the first guy that I review, and that will be coming out this week. So I want you to watch out for that. Follow me on Twitter at Wrestling Journal. You can follow me there and you'll see the review being announced. And then once the first episode launches, I will then also send out a design that shows the rating and the ranking that the wrestler has as well. So keep your eyes out on social media. Of course, if you're watching these on YouTube, make sure that you leave comments, leave feedback, talk about the wrestlers, leave all of your feedback and criticisms and critique there. Let's have discussions. I answer everyone on YouTube anyway, so wherever you leave the response, as long as I can see it, I will respond, and we can start having a conversation about the wrestlers and the way that we're reviewing. So I hope you've enjoyed this introduction episode. I know it's been a lot of detail, but I feel like it was important to do this first before we go into all of the reviews, just so that you can understand what this is about, how we're going to review the wrestlers, and that way you get a whole picture of the numbers that come out and the stats and the analytics. That way, when you see all the ratings, you at least have the knowledge to understand where it comes from. And also, if you want to use this as a formula for yourself so that you can rate your own wrestlers as we go along, you do that. And it would be great if people would actually rate the wrestlers that I review and then tell me your own ratings. Tell me what you think they are and where they would fit in your greatest wrestling list of all time. So, as for now, that's the end of this video. I'm X Harper. Thank you so much for watching this introductory episode. And until the first wrestling review of Kevin Nash this week, have a great day, have a great week, and I'll see you soon.